Station QRSA, the voice of the city, on the air 24 hours daily.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet.
And with that familiar quote, we welcome you to another episode of Wild About Jolson, the third episode thus far. Once again, we have our same panel as before. We'll go ahead and let you guys introduce yourselves in case no one heard the last shows.
Hello, folks. It's Andrew.
Hi, this is Vlad Petnicki.
And hello, this is Andrea.
And this is Nigel Dreiner again. And we wanted to quickly touch on something before we jumped into our main discussion for this episode. And that's the Wild About Jolson Facebook page that Andrea started not too long ago. And thank you for doing that because it's gotten a lot of attention and there's a lot of great conversation going on that page. Not only about our show and the topics we discuss, but people just posting their own Jolson history and their photos and all of that. So we're really excited to have that be around. And Vlad, you posted something. Well, actually, you and Andrea had kind of a connection there. You guys posted the interview that Vlad had with someone at one of his shows recently. You want to mention that briefly?
Yes, I was. I performed. I do about an hour and a half one-man show that I call the Jolson Tribute Show. You know, I come out there, I tell some of the gags that Jolson told in World War II era appearances, sing some of his songs the best that I can. Well, when I had scheduled that appointment, the lady running the activities for the West Los Angeles Veterans Home called me and she said, by the way, there's an African-American veteran here who's really looking forward to your show. He was a big Jolson fan. And then a light turned on in my head. One of the things I try to emphasize in the biographical opening to the show is Jolson's relationship with African-American artists and African-Americans of his day. I mean, they admired him because he's fought for equal treatment of African Americans in show business from the very beginning of his career, and they had no problem with him with his appearing in blackface because they recognized that it was a tribute. He had borrowed so much of the African American performing tradition in creating his own act, and he championed the work of African American composers and performers. We'll talk about that in more detail at another show. So the light went on. Hey, I emailed Andrea, and I said, hey, how about if I see if this gentleman will agree for me to interview him on camera, and I'll send you the video, and if it's worthwhile, you might be able to use it in your documentary. And so that's exactly what happened. I wound up interviewing Lieutenant Commander Samuel Nickens, who was a 92-year-old U.S. Navy World War II vet.
Wow.
And Sonny Rose, who was an 83-year-old Korean-era vet, both of them African-American fans of Jolson. And they confirmed everything that I'd read, which is that, they looked at Jolson, who was somebody, as Lieutenant Commander Nickens said, who, quote, stood with the blacks, unquote, in terms of being against things like segregated restaurants and so on and so forth. And also they admired him as a great artist. They didn't have any problem with the fact that he performed in blackface during his Broadway career or in many of his films.
Andrea, is that going to be in your documentary?
Oh, yes, of course. I wanted to add that before Vlad came up with these two interviews, which are really amazing, we only had one African-American. Do you say African-American, actually? I'm not sure about
Yes.
the terminology. Okay. In our film, or at least the footage we shot so far. And that was a very brief scene when we were standing on Broadway and we just randomly tried to interview people and ask them about El Jolson. That was when El Jolson Way was inaugurated, or whatever it's called. And so we randomly interviewed people, and there was one African-American guy who stopped and he started to sing Mammy. And he didn't have any problem with blackface, apparently. And he knew who Jolson was and he liked him and stuff, but he didn't say much more. So that was the only thing we had so far. So then Vlad came up with these two interviews. That was just amazing. And I think the most amazing thing this Mr. Nickens said was that at first he thought, I think he encountered this at school, at high school, he mentioned that. And
yeah, he mentioned that was the first that he had heard Jolson in music appreciation class.
Right.
Wow.
And then at first he thought this was another way to be demeaning of African Americans, to do something that would be demeaning. And then he saw Jolson perform, and then he ended up seeing it completely differently. And then he said, you need, in order to understand what Jolson was doing, you need to see him perform, because then you definitely know this is not racist, what he was doing. I found that remarkable.
Yeah, there are a lot of
Yes,
people today that I think could open their mind like that. It would serve them well to open their mind and give something a chance first before making a snap
Right.
judgment.
yes, and Lieutenant Commander Nickens was from Alabama. So as he pointed out in an interview, it was back in the days of segregation, and for him, who lived through that, as a small child in the 30s and the 40s, for him to come out and say that, I think is pretty significant. And also the perception, which it's one thing reading the history book, but somebody who was alive back then telling it to you has some more credibility.
Right.
Saying that, yeah, Jolson stood with the blacks. If a restaurant was segregated, wouldn't serve blacks, Jolson wouldn't go to eat there. And we know the famous story way back in 1915 when Jolson was only about 29, a star playing a road version of one of his shows at Hartford, Connecticut. He read in the newspaper that U.B. Blake and Noble Sissle, two African-American artists that he personally didn't know, who weren't as famous as they were about to become, U.B. Blake being one of the most foremost ragtime and jazz pianists in the first half of the
I'm
20th
just wild
century.
about Harry.
That's right. I'm
It
just
was written
talking
by
about
U.B.
Harry.
Blake.
And Noble Sissle was a songwriter, and he read that they were denied service at a hotel restaurant in Hartford, Connecticut the night before. He had them tracked down, even though he didn't know them from Adam. And he told them, I'm going to take you back to that restaurant. If anybody refuses the service, I'm going to punch him right in the nose. And because Jolson had a fiery temper, and being Jewish, of course, in turn of the century America, growing up a Jewish immigrant, he undoubtedly had felt discrimination against Jews on his own hide, so to speak. So I think that he identified with the worst discrimination that African Americans faced. And to finish that quickly finish that story, well, they calmed him down. They prevailed on him that probably wasn't a good idea, to do that. So he said, fine. He took them to a Jewish deli, bought him sandwiches, and we know the story because it's in Noble Sissle's autobiography. And as Sissle wrote, for the rest of the night, we sat on the hood of his car eating these delicious sandwiches while Jolson sang to us.
That's
And
even better.
right, and 35 years later, Noble Sissle was the representative of I believe it was the Negro Screen Actors Guild. That may not be the exact name, but at Jolson's funeral. And of course, Jolson's magnificent memorial temple that's above his sarcophagus at Hillside Memorial Cemetery in Los Angeles was designed by Paul Revere Williams, I believe, who was one of the foremost African American architects of the 20th century. So,
And this is a perfect segue into our topic because what you just mentioned was that when you look at Jolson films now and you look at, the blackface issue and everything, unless you have a prior knowledge to the history behind it, it's easy to judge unfairly the situation. If you want to just jump right into to Big Boy, our feature film discussion.
Big Boy was Jolson's fifth film, I believe. It came out in 1930, and it's unique in that it is the only film that really is a filmed version of one of his most popular Broadway stage shows. So from that standpoint, it's a priceless historical artifact because it captures the comedic style of Jolson on the Broadway stage. It's also unique for a reason that makes it very difficult for folks to understand today who don't have any knowledge of that period of time and of Jolson.
It's essentially a stage show on film. Sort of like when I was watching it, it's sort of like The Coconuts, which was the Marx Brothers' first movie. It's essentially just a film stage show. This one has a little bit more to it. There's the horse scene, and there's a couple of scenes they probably couldn't do on stage, but essentially you can tell they didn't adapt it a whole lot to the screen. They just kind of took the stage script and filmed it. And it shows because it's a very quickly made film, you can tell as well.
But I think another reason why it's so important, especially to Jolson fans, is because it's where Jolson plays on screen his most beloved character. It's what made Jolson famous and loved by so many Broadway audiences. He plays Gus on screen. And the fact that he played that character on stage hundreds and hundreds of times we'll never see. We have it documented in Big Boy.
Yes, and so I mean, there is a story, but there are also flashbacks in the story to Gus's grandfather, also played by Jolson. There are lots of comedy gags. It's the funniest Jolson film, but what makes it, I think, very difficult for people to watch today is that it's the only Jolson film in which he doesn't appear in some song sequences in blackface. he actually plays the Gus character, which
Right.
is an African-American jockey in this particular movie, the entire film. And it's very difficult for folks today who don't have the knowledge of the history of Broadway of that time and of Jolson in particular to know what to make of it. And that's what I think makes this such a fascinating film to discuss.
Big Boy came out at the Winter Garden in 1924. Is that correct?
24 or 25, I believe, yes.
Somewhere around there. So about 6 years later, they decided to make this film version of it. I was interested in the fact that you have the jazz singer, and then you have the singing fool, which was essentially trying to do the jazz singer again. Then you have Say It With Songs, which was just a drama. Then you
Which tried to cash in on the success of Sonny Boy. It had a very similar plot with a plot that tried to tear your heartstrings regarding a sick child.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And
it was just trying to ride the coattails of the previous success.
Yes, and unfortunately, it succeeded in that regard, in that it made a lot of money for Warner Brothers, Say It With Songs, Jolson's third film, because the Singing Fool, the year before, the song with the song Sonny Boy that Jolson sings, to his little 3-year-old son, Davy Lee, who then dies, and Jolson has to sing the song right after learning of his son's death. They try to recreate that success by casting Davy Lee in a similar role. They ran out Say It With Songs in 1929, his third film. It made a lot of money, and it was a disaster for Jolson because it was not a good film. The plot was obviously just a thin repeat of Sonny Boy. Jolson's attempts to act as a serious actor were seriously wanting, because he was coming out of a Broadway, comedic musical comedy tradition. He wasn't a Shakespearean actor, and it was obvious. So it basically torpedoed Jolson's film career to a great deal afterwards, because the reviews were so bad.
Well, that's the thing too, though. I mean, the jazz singer came out, and then all of a sudden, Jolson, who was primarily a comedian, was now thought of as a dramatic actor. So the Singing Fool, he's a dramatic actor, and Say It With Songs, he's a dramatic actor. And I think what I was trying to say a minute ago was, Say It With Songs kind of flopped, and Warner Brothers was like, we need to go back and do what made Jolson Jolson. So they did Mammy, which was going back to the minstrel show stuff, which they even purported on the posters at the time. Jolson back in blackface. And then Mammy came out, was a tremendous success, and it was followed up the exact same year, 1930, by Big Boy. So I'm thinking they said, well, hey, Mammy was a great success. It was based on his, not necessarily a stage show, but the minstrel shows of the past. So why don't we go back and do a successful Jolson stage show as a film? And I feel like that was the exact strain of consciousness that they probably had.
I agree. I think it was a deliberate choice. Just like it was a deliberate choice to almost redo The Singing Fool with Say It With Songs. Even Little Pal was almost a shameless ripoff of Sonny Boy. Didn't meet nearly the success Sonny Boy did. Jolson would say later in his career that Sonny Boy wasn't that successful. It only bought him a house in Florida, right?
Well, Davy Lee, I know, has said that he liked the song from Say It With Songs better than Sonny Boy. What was it?
Little Pal.
Little Pal, yeah. He liked Little Pal better than Sonny Boy, so...
Yeah, I think the popular opinion was that Sonny Boy was not a great song. I mean, wasn't there a story about how the songwriters were almost embarrassed to sing it for Jolson, but Jolson was able to intuit that it would be a great success, and he was exactly right. But trying to redo it with a similar song and a similar film, they probably realized, okay, we've gotten as much mileage out of this theme as we can. And I think Nigel's exactly right. They made a conscious decision at that point to just turn things around, get away from that format, and go back to what Jolson's. Yes, those films are successful, especially the Jazz Singer and the Singing Fool. But now it's time. It's done. That's been done. Now it's time to go back to Jolson's previous success, which was the stage, and try to do something on screen that would reflect that.
I would like to point out something, because you mentioned this kitschy Sonny Boy song.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just call it kitschy. It makes me think of an interview we did with Stephen Mohannan, who played Jolson in Jolson and Company in 1999, the stage show. And he said that part of Jolson's authenticity was that Jolson was absolutely incapable of being ironic. So even with those kitschy songs, like in The Jazz Singer or in The Singing Fool or Say It With Songs, you did... Despite this kitschiness, is kitchen is a word? I don't know. But despite that, you did believe him. You did believe him in that moment when he sang it, and that's, I think, also that what touches part of the whole blackface issue. You believe when he's in that mask, wearing that mask and performing, you do believe him, and this, I think, plays a big role in the fact that Jolson is authentic and not mocking anyone.
Right.
Right. And just to finish the discussion on Sonny Boy, I recall an interview that George Burns did, maybe 50 years later, when he was talking about Jolson, and he remembered the story that the songwriters were embarrassed to bring the song to Jolson because they kind of did it as a gag. Jolson looked at it and said, "Yep, this will do." And
Yeah.
and as George Burns put it in that interview, he said, "Well, you know what happened when Jolson sang Sonny Boy? Jolson cried, and when Jolson cried, the audience cried, and
Right.
it
That's
became
it.
the first 1 or 2 million selling song in history." And in fact, it's ironic, but at the very end of the film that we're discussing, Big Boy, Jolson comes out as himself on a stage and offers to sing to the audience another number, and somebody says, "Sing Sonny Boy," and the audience starts getting up to leave, and he says, "No, don't go. I'm not going to sing Sonny
So
Boy."
it had already become a joke even as early as 1930.
Yeah.
That the
That
song was
song,
overdone.
by the way, that was translated to German. I think I posted this on on several Facebook pages too. I mean, that
You
was
did.
that successful. Yeah.
And what I loved about that, what you posted, it was the 1928 arrangement of Sonny
Right.
Boy,
Yeah.
but it was like a modern. I don't know when it was recorded, but it was a much better fidelity than I'm used to hearing that 1928 version. So even though it was sung in German,
Right.
it felt like this was what it sounded like when they were recording it in 1928. It
I
sounded
think it was.
fantastic.
I think it was recorded in the 50s, as far as I believe.
It
Yeah.
sounds
But it's
great. I wish I could get a karaoke track of that version.
That'd be cool. It's funny though. It's funny though because we think of Sonny Boy as the first song that, and I know we're straying from our discussion about Big Boy a little bit, but we think of Sonny Boy as a song that really, and it was a song that catapulted in a way that makes us think about Jolson singing sentimental songs about a child. But even before Sonny Boy in the Jazz Singer, there was Dirty Hands, Dirty Face, which actually followed a very similar format. But it wasn't this. It wasn't the hit of this movie like Sonny Boy was for the Singing Fool. So actually, Sonny Boy, as unique as it was at the time, really kitschy, as Andrea says correctly. There had been a song even equally, in my opinion, as kitschy, but equally as excellent also that in the previous year in the Jazz Singer, but it just never reached nearly the success that Sonny Boy had.
Right. So, Big Boy and Mammy, which are the two films in which Jolson went back to his Broadway comedic stage tradition, unfortunately, they didn't do very well, partly probably because of the depression that had just started, but largely because the public was so turned off by Say It With Songs that his movie career never fully recovered. But
Well, Mammy didn't do too badly, did it?
it did better than Big Boy. I believe that
Yeah.
Big Boy had a very short run.
Well, I mean, they obviously invested money in those color scenes in Mammy. I mean,
yes,
that can't be denied that they had at least a little faith in it because they were willing to do a couple color segments in it.
right. Because color film had started being used in the late 1920s in musicals, and sadly, most of those musical films simply don't survive because the color film stock deteriorated much more quickly. But yeah, so a gimmick was to insert color sequences into musicals, which is what they did with Jolson's film Mammy in 1929, 1930, and which fortunately managed to survive.
And they chose wisely which scene to film in color too, because they seen that big sweeping minstrel show scene, which is obviously going to be much more impressive in color than a scene where maybe Jolson's just talking backstage to his colleagues. So I think that was a calculated decision as well.
Andrea, you mentioned earlier you were doing some research on the film before we recorded this. You mentioned you read a little article that said that in 1930 musical films were kind of starting to look down upon by audiences, and they actually cut some musical sequences out of Big Boy that still remain gone from this day.
Right, I didn't know that myself. I just read it a few minutes before we started this recording. Yeah.
Yes, it's a very short film. It's only about an hour long, if I remember correctly.
Right, yeah, it's 67 minutes, I think, yeah.
And so they promoted Big Boy as more of a comedy instead of a musical, which is something I didn't know. Yeah.
Right, me neither. I have to admit, I can't say much more about that. I just read it and I didn't know myself, actually. But I wanted to add something to Mammy. I remember that because I wanted to talk about Mammy, at least about some scenes in my oral exams at my university, and our film professor said that the worst film in the history of film, he thinks, is Mammy. And I so disagree with him, but so this will be a big challenge when I have my oral exams because he really disagrees with him. But when it comes to the research I did with the people we interviewed for our Jolson documentary and everything, the scene, yes, we have no bananas scene in Mammy, my favorite scene. This Stephen Mohan I mentioned before, and also ethnomusicologist Mark Slobin we talked to. They both said that Jolson is so much anti-establishment in this film because he's mocking opera in blackface.
Right. And it's not
this
the
is
first time he did that either. If you think as far back as his early Victor recordings, didn't he mock opera
right.
with Asleep in the Deep, right?
Yes, and this
So,
is so much anti-establishment, and this is aimed at the working class people. Although, of course, Jolson was famous on Broadway, so it's a different kind of audience there already. But the whole history of blackface and minstrelsy comes from being popular among working class people, and also the identification of with African Americans as outsiders of society. So this all fits with the whole idea of anti-establishment. So I think this is very interesting, and I really love this. It's another scene where Stephen Mohan would say, "You do believe him? He's not ironic here. It's just funny and highly comedic." I love
yeah.
this.
To kind of steer back towards Big Boy, which is the film that we're discussing today.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's no, it requires a lot of background, which we've hopefully been providing for the listeners. I remember seeing this film back in the 80s for the first time. It was one of the first movies that I'd seen with Jolson. And I remember thinking after seeing it, wow, in this film, he reminds me of a blackface, wisecracking Groucho Marx, at his best. And I think that there is I don't know how to put it, kind of a subversive undertone to this film in that he does play an African-American jockey, an African-American character in the film, rather than playing himself as by another name, simply blacking up for some numbers. Nevertheless, as in his Broadway stage shows, he is the hero. He runs circles around and makes fun of and often ridicules the other characters who were all white in the film. At that time, it would not have been possible to make a successful film, where an actual African-American actor would do the same thing. The white audiences wouldn't have stood for it. But Jolson, as Gus in blackface, was able to do that. And I can't imagine that this fact was lost on the African-American audiences of the day. Remember that when the Jazz Singer came out, the Harlem Amsterdam News, an African-American newspaper, said that every colored man should be proud of his performance in the Jazz Singer. Well, I think there are two reasons for that. Number one is he was obviously very well known in New York for having, financially backed the very first all African American produced play on Broadway, for standing up for equal treatment for African Americans in show business, for being the very first big star to use an all African American orchestra to back his shows on Broadway, for trying to actually include African American acts in his own stage shows when Broadway was segregated. So they looked at Jolson as a friend. They also saw as Andrea pointed out, they also saw Jolson's performances in blackface as homage, in a way. They recognized that far from trying to ridicule African Americans, he was incorporating a lot of that African American performing tradition and singing style, in his own way, and he was giving credit to where it's due. So it couldn't have been. I think that African American audiences of 1930 watching this film would have recognized a subtext, if you will, that would have been lost on the white audiences. And that is, hey, this is Jolson, but he's playing an African-American character, and he's making these other white folks in the movie look foolish.
Right.
He's the hero. I mean, to me, one of the most remarkable scenes in Big Boy, maybe the most remarkable scene, once you start thinking along these lines, is the scene in which Gus, the grandfather of the current Gus, in a flashback to a period shortly after the Civil War, saves the future family matriarch from being kidnapped by this gunslinger by the name of Bully John Bagby, and gains fame because he chases him on a horse. He jumps off the horse onto the horse where Bagby has got this lady that he's kidnapping, and then he hog ties him and he drags him back. I mean, needless to say, it would have been impossible to have a scene with an African American hog tying and dragging through the dirt a white man
You're
in
right.
1930.
Right.
by anybody other than Jolson playing that scene in blackface, and yet that is exactly the scene that you see. And obviously, there's how do I put it, kind of a subversive subtext to the film that wouldn't have been lost on African Americans who already knew that Jolson was a friend of the African American community, and who could obviously view that scene and and chuckle at it, because here he was doing something that they wouldn't have been allowed to do on the screen. But that's how barriers are broken. If it wasn't for Jolson doing that, and if it wasn't for Stepin Fetchit, the famous African-American comedian, bringing his character over to regular films, white audiences would have never gotten comfortable with the idea of African-Americans actually playing those types of roles themselves.
Right. I was thinking along those same lines, Vlad, when I was preparing for this recording, because you talked about the black audiences of 1930, and I agree. But I want to talk for a minute about white audiences or any audience of 2016 who is convinced, who has their mind made up that this is a racist film. Obviously, some of the scenes will be shocking. Scenes where Jolson is using the dialect. In 2016, that looks shocking. But all one needs to do really is look at the plot. You have the grandson of a slave who works in a stable who outsmarts the grandson of a slave owner. And then in the flashback scene, you have the actual ex-slave outsmart, prominent white men. So it's obvious by watching those scenes and by analyzing who the filmmakers, who the actors sympathize with. It's not the white characters.
Who the hero is of that whole
film,
yeah.
That's exactly right.
A couple of things I wanted to just mention real quick before I forget. This was directed by Alan Crosland, who of course did The Jazz Singer, and if you watch the intro of the film, it takes right off. There's no lull. It goes right from the opening credits scene into a big, grand musical number. They don't waste any time getting into it.
Yes, right, and I wonder if the fact that they wanted to originally, like the article Andrea found said that they wanted it to be a big sweeping musical, so they wanted to get that audience right away. Okay, here's what you're in for. You're in for these big dance numbers, and then obviously maybe they had more than what we see now. Some are cut, but I think that they wanted to make a balance between comedy and musical, so they tried to grab the audience in right away with that opening scene. And that opening scene, in my opinion, is one of the best visions of Jolson we have that exists on tape.
Yes, and that opening scene, there are two musical scenes that I think bear particular close comment. It's the opening scene, which Jolson as Gus is walking out towards the entrance to the ranch, and he sings an upbeat 1920s jazz tune called Liza Lee, but he's singing it along with an all African American cast of dancers, and I believe one gentleman is actually playing a harmonica, who are providing the backup. Now, this is for somebody who doesn't know anything about Jolson and his relationship with African Americans and how he was seen at the time. This is one of those aha moments, because it's one of the two musical scenes in the movie in which all of the other actors, dancers, and singers who are all around Jolson, who are backing up, they're actual African Americans. So the first question that should cross somebody's mind is, well, wait a minute. Why would they be doing this scene with Jolson if what he was doing is bad? The reason is, of course, they looked at him as not only as a great artist, but as a friend of the African American community. Yeah, they didn't interpret what he was doing as demeaning at all. And in fact, there is a scene at the end of Liza Lee, the opening musical number, when Jolson finishes. One of the African American dancers, who was all around him, goes up to him and shakes his hand. And I'm convinced, because at that time in films, these scenes were filmed with the music was recorded as they were performing. It wasn't I don't think it was lip synced. I'm convinced that this is a camera capturing a moment that wasn't scripted, but that was purely spontaneous. The way that they look at him, it's clear that this is an artist and a man they admire. And the way that fellow walks up to him and shakes his hand at the end of the number, I think says a lot.
I agree. I don't think that was in the script. I don't think the script said, okay, after the number is over, you walk over to the Jolson's character and shake his hand. I don't think it was. You could tell the gesture was heartfelt just by watching the man do it. I mean, you mentioned that, Vlad, recently in either one of our chats or on the page, and I took note of that scene after I read your comments, and I watched it and I noticed it, and I was equally impressed. It was definitely a heartfelt gesture on that man's part.
Andrea, go ahead.
I just wanted to add. It just made me think of. I'm sure you read Black Like You by Ralph, do you say Ralph Ellison Strasberg, I think you call him. And I found that very interesting. I read that a while ago, but I wrote about it in this little article.
Maybe you better give a little background as to what that
Yeah,
what that was about.
he wrote about that he sees a link between, or he asked the question why African American people actually did accept, because there was this minstrel tradition in the early or mid 19th century which was rather racist, but then the more vaudeville type Jolson did in the early 20th century was different. So he sees a link, or he asked the question why African Americans actually did like what Jolson did, and he sees a link between what Jolson did and an African American cultural figure or stereotype called griot. Not sure if this is a stage figure. Not sure if you heard about it. It's a West African singer and storyteller, which is highly satirical. So you can read about it on Wikipedia or whatever. So that might be, or he suggests that this might be a reason why African Americans did, because this was really known by African Americans. This is such a big, like Shakespeare in our culture. This is really known stage figure. So this is why they might have, related Jolson to this, or Gus, the figure of Gus, related to this stage figure of griot. I think it's called griot. It's a French name, griot, I think.
Yeah, and
it's pretty much what Gus was on stage.
Yeah, and I think the theatrical tradition, wherever it harkens from, whether it's Europe or Africa, they're similar types of characters. In other types of popular, I think, theater.
Right, like the Harlequin.
Exactly the Harlequin, the jester, or a servant who actually is much smarter than his master.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
And Gus is really kind of a conglomeration of all those characters, Americanized within the African American tradition. So in that sense, yeah, I agree with you. And in terms of the way that he was seen by African Americans, they identified with a character because he wasn't ridiculing them. He was actually the hero of the plays and the situations that he found himself in. And in Big Boy, there's another scene, flashback sequence, where Jolson as Gus, but the grandfather of the present day Gus, does this great brave deed of saving this future matriarch of the family from this bully John Bagby who tries to kidnap her. But there's a scene in that flashback where Jolson sings a number of Negro spirituals with an all African American singers, and there's a little moment which I also think captures kind of a bit of a kind of a candid moment. Just when Jolson walks onto the stage and all these other singers are already there, it's an outdoor shot, and he says, "Now wait a minute, boys, let me get the right key," or something like that. And he sings a couple of lines, and you hear one of them say, "You got it?" And says, "Yep, I got it. Hold on." And then he starts singing, and they sing,
"Go Down Moses."
Yeah, "Go Down Moses." Yep. Well, "Let My People Go" or "Go Down Moses."
Right. Yeah.
And of course, here is a Jew, singing about Moses taking the Israelite slaves out of Egypt, but he's singing it as an African American with an all African American, supporting cast of singers, and of course, so it is a double meaning to have Jolson there as a member of the race whose great leader Moses took the Israelites out of Egypt, and he's singing it with African Americans who had their own long journey out of slavery, and then the 100 years it took out of segregation.
And this, so I think, it's a great example of mutual identification. So it's not just Jews identifying with African Americans, but this is a Negro spiritual, which is, this was written by African American, I think, and referring to a scene of the Old Testament about freeing the Jewish slaves in Israel. So the identification of African Americans with Jews comes before the 20th century Jewish identification with African Americans. And so it's working both ways. And
it's a way to show that he can relate to their suffering in some way.
And all this from something that was promoted as a comedy.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I want to add that when I watched this first as a German, I have to admit, I watched this in, I think, 2007 or so. When I watched this, before that, I've never encountered blackface. The whole blackface cultural history I had no clue about. I've never seen this before other than in Othello and Shakespearean plays or anything. So, but when I didn't I watched this film. I thought, why the hell is Jolson? I know with this, he was wearing a wig and the jazz singer and everything, but I was thinking, what the hell is this? He's playing an African American. I found this weird. But once the scene started, when he's singing "Goat on Moses" and he becomes one of the African Americans, he's one of them. He's not above them or anything. They are one. This is a unity. Although I had no knowledge whatsoever, I had not done any research, but I felt that there is a deep meaning to this whole scene. And of course, after the research, I felt confirmed.
Yes, and as a member of the Jewish race, as it would have been called back then, kind of gave him credibility to bring that over, put that song over in a way that somebody who's Irish, what the hell are you doing? Singing about Moses taking the slaves out of Egypt with Africa. As a Jew, that gave him that biblical credibility and background, I think, to sing that song and establish that identification. I don't know if that makes sense, but that just kind of occurs to me. And not only that, but because as a Jewish immigrant in turn of the century America, he undoubtedly, was very well aware and himself faced discrimination, not as bad as African Americans, but still, Jews were discriminated against as well.
Oh, without doubt. Yeah.
So there was that commonality of experience, not just going back to the days of the Bible, but the history of persecution of the Jewish people, even up to the discrimination they felt in America, the Promised Land, that I think created a bond so that these African Americans could accept him as the great artist that he was and see what he was doing was legitimate and coming out of his soul rather than just being something that he affected, put on as one would put on an air. That's not what Jolson's act was about at all.
And something else I would just think of it right now, when it comes to the link between Jews or Jewish identification with the African Americans, the Plantation Act, you all know, of course. I read about this double meaning of the actual, cotton wool plant and the political term, I think from 1740 or 1741, which was about the naturalization process of Jews in America, granted to Jewish applicants by the British Parliament, I think, at that time. So there is this very interesting double meaning already when it comes to the Plantation Act.
I was going to say, going into the performances in the film,
Yep.
one that stands out to me specifically is the villain, Bagby, because I'm not sure if because, the early talkies, the acting wasn't so great just because everybody was getting used to working with sound film. But here's his villain who's so over the top. He could have come out of a cartoon. The way he speaks,
right.
and the well, here I am. I'm the villain. The way he's talking is like a parody of what someone like that should be. So I'm not sure if that was a conscious choice or
I think
not.
that's how it is with stereotypes. I mean, if you think about today, where you still, in a subtle way, have blackface, like in cartoons, like in what's this called, the Mermaid, whatever that was called. What's it called? The Mermaid, the film, the Disney film,
The Little Mermaid.
Little
yeah.
Mermaid, yeah.
The Little Mermaid, right? Or this the donkey in Shrek, spoken by Eddie Murphy. We had Mark Sloban, this ethnomusicologist we interviewed, mentioned this, that even to this day we have blackface, but just more in subtle ways, especially in cartoons. So I think this works very well. This is a genre which works very well for these stereotypes.
Yes,
Yeah,
and the character of Bully John Bagby in the film was played by Noah Beery, kind of a barrel-chested, gravelly-voiced actor, and he was a comedy, but they had to make him, very clearly a really, really bad guy. So
Right.
I think his over the
Not so
top,
subtle.
his over the top. I want you rascals to know just who I am. I'm
Right.
Bullet John Bagby, the fighter, the tornado of New Orleans. I got 15 notches in the handle of my pistol and 15 dead men lying by my bullets. And while he's saying this, Gus, who he's forcing to shine his boots, is ad-libbing these little lines that, Bagby's not hearing, that are ridiculing everything that he says, which is what makes that scene so classic.
Yeah,
And,
I think
It's
it was
so
a
easy to
conscious.
laugh at him.
Right, I think that's why he plays that way, that over the top
Or the
character.
scene with the jockey, Oh, I love that when he's hitting him with this, I think, this towel on the
Yeah.
head all the time. Oh God, I love this.
Yeah, I think he played that role on purpose, or he was meant to play that role on purpose, so over the top, so that it would be easy to ridicule him, and he would come across as even that much more of a buffoon, so that we rejoice even more in Gus's victory over him.
This film too is something that, when I was watching it today, something that came to mind. If you compare the Jolson films to what Eddie Cantor was doing at Goldwyn when he was making his films, I would say this character of Gus is the closest you could compare to the kind of characters that Eddie Cantor played, which a lot of Jolson fans say Jolson should have followed the mold of Eddie Cantor at Goldwyn and played more of these instead of trying to throw him into all these jazz singer dramas. Warner Brothers really missed the mark with Jolson. It's like they didn't really know what to do with him.
Just stuff. Yeah.
But it's understandable why Jolson was chosen for the jazz singer, because he was the biggest star in the country at the time. So
of course,
they wanted to make their mark with this first talking picture with the biggest star.
Yeah.
That's why Jessel didn't end up with the role, and Jolson did.
Right.
Yeah,
And
but after that, it
unfortunately-
was Mammy all over again.
Right.
Yeah, the jazz singer followed by the singing fool. Those films were both only partly sound. Even the singing fool, which had some extended sound sequences, was still primarily a silent film. And then Jolson's first all sound film, which was Saved with Songs, was also the only film in which he never appears in blackface, and they try to sell him as a dramatic leading man. And sadly, that was at least at that stage of his career, it was beyond his ability to carry over, to put over. And unfortunately, that is the failure of that film in terms of, critically, really limited the rest of Jolson's film career in terms of what was available to him, in terms of roles.
Well, even in Mammy, he's got they really play up the relationship with his mother, and and even Mammy's trying to get away from the jazz singer type story, but they got to have a mother he's in love with, and they have to somehow hit the beats of the jazz singer in every Jolson film, and this was Big Boy was kind of the first film that threw all that stuff away and said, let's just do something from the stage.
Right, they had kind of worn that formula out, I think, and made that choice to rehash the stage performances.
Yeah, unfortunately for Jolson's career, it's probably a couple of films too late to try to do that. But it's a wonderful film as a historical artifact of the Gus character, which was the character that made him the biggest star in the country, on Broadway, and then as a recording artist in the 1920s. As well as this subtext of this very subversive subtext of an African-American character, being the hero of the film and, ridiculing and running rings around, the white characters. There's another scene in the flashback sequence, which is a sequence with the bully John Bagby, where Bagby calls Gus and he asks him, come on over here and, dust my boots, shine his boots. And Gus says, listen, I'm
a free man now.
I'm free now, and I don't have to dust off anybody's boots. And then, Bagby pulls out a pistol and says, now, are you going to shine my boots, or am I going to empty this pistol in your abdomen? And then Gus pretends not to hear. He says, oh, why did you say you want your boot dusted? I never heard you. And he starts dusting off his boots. So another one of the African-American characters calls him over and says, why are you dusting a man's boots off for? You're any man's equal now. The Constitution says so. And Gus says, listen, when a man's got a pistol in your abdomen, boy, you ain't got no Constitution. Now, that is funny. It's kind of a corny old funny gag. But think about that subversive subtext, as I call it, to this film. An African-American in 1930 watching that scene would have nodded his head, because this was the truth down south. Yes. He was making fun of something that was very much an ugly fact of life.
Yeah,
exactly. It's a social commentary.
Exactly. And what happens at the end of that scene? Gus rescues the gal that Bagby is trying to kidnap and hog ties him and drags him through the dirt.
Right.
Yeah, it's
So
clear who's good and who's bad.
it's definitely a social commentary, but let's not deny the fact that there are some hilarious one-liners in that film too. It was a comedy. We're analyzing it for
Right.
social commentary for its underlying themes, but it was also a comedy. It
Of
was
course. Of
there are
course.
some hilarious jokes that Jolson would later rehash in his career
Yeah,
more than
I mean
once.
Well,
his
you're right
interact.
too, because he seems much more natural in this film than he does in the dramatic role actor. Where you can tell, I'm not sure how much of it was scripted and how much of it was ad lib, but you could tell he was in a much more comfortable environment in this film than he was in any of them prior.
Right.
Definitely.
And what you were saying before is the fact that we have all this underlying social commentary, but at the heart of it, this is a comedy. So why don't we get into some of the more comedic aspects of the film?
Well, my
Uh,
favorite one-liner of the film is the one-liner that one of Jolson's best gags, in my opinion, in the film is the line that goes, "Oh, I've never ridden a jackass." Well, you ought to get on to yourself.
Well, yeah, in that particular scene, a British jockey is
Uh,
who was supposedly a famous British jockey, is telling the story of how he won the English Derby, and as he's telling the story, Jolson is kind of ad libbing these comments, ridiculing him, and then Jolson says, "Now I'll tell one," and he says,
yeah,
on the day of the Brown Derby, the England's sun wasn't even up yet. Which is a play on
Right.
the famous old saying, "The sun never set on the British Empire."
right.
And he says
So
that
again,
day he says that day I was riding a jackass, and the British jockey goes, "Oh, that's an excellent story. I was never able to ride a jackass." And Gus goes, "You ought to get onto yourself."
Which is just
right.
another example of Jolson's character Gus making a mockery of what are considered to be prominent white characters.
Right. The anti-establishment
Right,
idea you have
right.
again here. Yeah.
And of course the scene "Hooray for Baby and Me," which is, I would say, the apex of the film as far as the performances go. I don't want to say the apex,
Runaway.
the most Jolson like scene in the film as far as Jolson taking the stage in a nightclub.
Right, and this is what Stephen Mohannan, who I mentioned before, with the actor who played Jolson in Jolson and Company in 1999, who said that this is a perfect scene where you see how Jolson added or adapted this, what African Americans stood for, this freedom and looseness on stage, which was not really accepted by white performers yet, but he took it onto a stage like Broadway, serious theater stage where not just working class people, like in circuses before in the 19th century, watched these kind of performances, but really middle class and upper class people watched this kind of. So he established this freedom and looseness on stage, which you later also see. Oh no, not later, but before you see in Toot Toot Tootsie Goodbye, and the jazz singer without blackface. Though I mean, this sexual, like this Elvis Presley type kind of dance, which you see in the 50s with Elvis Presley and stuff.
Hmm.
So
But
Go ahead.
also inserting a little bit of what I think was very, very common on the Broadway musical stage, a little bit of that almost effeminate demeanor at times in his performances, rolling of the eyes, and
right,
so yeah, Jolson was very much cutting edge in that regard, because when he took off the blackface, he still performed and moved on stage the same way.
The same way,
yeah,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Right, and I think we can see that.
Authenticity. You have it. That was him.
Right, and I think you can see
Right.
that what Vlad refers to, that if almost effeminate, those effeminate characteristics of Jolson. I think throughout his career you could see them: the smacking of the lips, the rolling of the eyes, the
Yeah.
swaying of the hips. But he knew just when to stop, when to draw back, and when to use it. He knew not to overdo it, but he wasn't afraid to show it a little bit as well.
Right.
And Vlad, you mentioned something about Maurice Chevalier, if you want to go into that.
The restaurant scene where Jolson as Gus, he's been unfairly fired by due to some machinations of gamblers who want Big Boy the horse to lose, so they don't want Gus riding him. And so while that is getting sorted out, he's working as a waiter in a restaurant, and there are a couple of wonderful comedy scenes, including how he manages to convince a guest who has ordered a plate of oysters that he doesn't want the oysters, so he can give them to his friend who came to the restaurant without his wallet. Is probably the funniest routine Jolson ever did on the screen.
And you
But
can see him in that scene too. When I watch it today, you can see Jolson mouthing the words that the other actor's saying to keep up with the gag, which is something that kind of an offshoot, which I've seen in other films. There's a Chaplin film called A King in New York, where Charlie's doing this bit back and forth with his son and his little son, and you can see he's mouthing the words that his son is saying. Obviously, they've rehearsed it a few times, but I thought that was an interesting kind of insight into the behind the scenes of this scene in Big Boy, because you can see Jolson mouthing the words of the other actor as they're performing that bit. 'Cause it's going so fast, but Jolson's keeping up with it,
Mm-hmm.
As Chaplin was, Jolson was a comedian, and a stage comedian and a physical comedian. It's not a coincidence that not only were they friends, but they admired each other's work greatly. But at the end of that comedy scene, Jolson runs up on stage to sing a song, and he sings "Hooray for Baby and Me," which is a wonderful 1920s, really upbeat number. And he does 3 choruses of the song, so it's longer than your average Jolson song. And he, changes the words and ad-libs some comedy. Well, the third time, he talks to the audience, as he did on Broadway. And he goes, "That's no way to dance the night before the Derby. Hold each other tight with all your might and let your conscience be your guide," as he's rolling his eyes. And then he goes into a second chorus. Well, by the time he gets to the third chorus, when the band starts to play again, he sings the song in French. And he's very clearly doing an imitation of the great French singer and comedian Maurice Chevalier. He's overdoing it, of course, which is part of the joke. And he does it in French, and at the very end goes back into English and finishes the song, as Jolson. I thought that's very funny, because Chevalier was a big star in France and came over to the United States and sometime in the 20s and became a big movie star here as well. And again, they were friends and admirers of each other's work. And Chevalier did an album of himself singing Jolson songs in the 50s as a tribute, Maurice Chevalier's tribute to Al Jolson.
Right,
so that was Jolson's tribute to a fellow artist.
Right.
Yeah, and I think again you see your links to European traditions, even theater traditions. If you think about Wonderbar,
We
there's
see that a lot in Wonderbar, right?
Theater adaptation on film, like The Jazz Singer and Big Boy, of course, and Mammy a little bit, where you see the whole topic of theater. So in Wonderbar, Belle Paris and all that.
Right. Wonderbar kind of depicts those sweeping nightclubs of the Europe of the 1930s, right?
Right, and that whole thing, I mean, leads, of course, to the end of Big Boy, where we have this almost a commentary about the film, a self-referential commentary about the film.
Right.
This is all about masks, it's imitation. It's just was just made up. It's film. It was, and now. Yeah.
Before we get to that, Andre, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to be doing this for the folks who haven't seen this film, but I'm going to give away the ending. So
Spoiler alert.
Well, if you're listening to this and you haven't seen the film, there's a real problem, I think.
Just stop now.
Jolson as Gus, he exposes the bad guys. He gets to ride Big Boy, and against all odds, he wins the Kentucky Derby. And then they ask him to say a few words. They give him the big wreath, the victor's wreath, and they stick a microphone in front of him. "Would you like to say a few words to the people listening on radio all over the world?" And then Jolson says, "Oh, you don't know what it's like to win the Kentucky Derby, but if you just give me a moment, folks, I'll tell you." And then Jolson spins around, and as he spins around, they do a little fade out as he's spinning around, and when he turns around, he's Jolson himself without the blackface. And as the camera pulls back, he's standing on an actual stage, and all the other actors in the movie are standing on the stage behind him, and there's an audience.
And masks. Yeah.
Yeah, and Andrea, I'll let you take it from there.
No, that's all I wanted to add.
So you have all the actors in the film all standing there as themselves, pretty much doing a curtain call. And, and this is something I noticed in these 1930s, 20s and 30s films. Like even when, you're watching Snow White, Walt Disney, and these early Disney films, they show you at the beginning, they like open an old book telling you this is based off of a book. Or, as in case of Big Boy, this is based off of a stage play. In these early days, they weren't afraid to show you where the source material was coming from.
Yeah, maybe because film or sound film was still a new medium.
It was still new, exactly.
Yeah.
And they weren't afraid to show you that what you were seeing was a story with a beginning and an end. There was
Right.
not this mentality that we have today where you have to become fully immersed in the story. It's just, no, it's a story. And that scene that Jolson plays in Whiteface at the end of Big Boy is a perfect epilogue to the story. And the story's over, and now it's almost like he's coming out on stage saying, okay, our story's over. We're going to take an encore. We're going to take our bows. We hope you liked it. And here's one more number.
Yeah,
Right.
powerful.
Exactly. And then he says, "What'll I sing?" And one of the other actors says, "Big Sonny Boy." And the audience
Right.
starts grumbling and starts leaving. He says, "Wait a minute, folks, I'm not going to sing Sonny Boy because not only was that song so overplayed by then, it was also a very sad song, and it would make people cry. So they didn't want to hear it. He sings "Tomorrow Is Another Day," which was, I guess, supposed to be the big hit from that movie because he sings it about 3 times
Right.
during the picture.
And I think the fact that he refuses, the fact that he was asked to sing Sonny Boy and people kind of groaned, was one of the earliest examples of Jolson's self-deprecating humor, which he would later show on radio more than anywhere else, because that would almost become a staple of his role in radio, especially later on in the Kraft Music Hall, where he would be the butt of a lot of jokes, jokes by Oscar Levant more than anything else. At Jolson's expense. And it's interesting to note that may be one of the first examples we see of Jolson's self-deprecating humor, which, for all the talk about his egoism, he wasn't afraid to take a poke at himself as well.
Yeah, if I may add, that this is just to prove how Jolson already has been an icon. I mean, this self-referentiality, if that's a word, this just proves that. He's Jolson right now, and everybody can
Right.
relate to what's typical for Jolson. He's an American icon.
Oh, yeah. By 1930, he had been one for more than 15 years, really.
Right.
Now, this film was obviously quickly made, and even
Yeah.
though we went through some of the great things about it, when you watch it, there are some things that show it was obviously made in a very fast time frame. The version that makes me laugh, not it's supposed to be like a thrilling chase sequence with these horses, but how they cut it, it's so obvious. It's actors on fake horses being bumped up and down with a fake screen behind them. And
Right.
when Bagby's shooting at Jolson, it cuts to Jolson riding the horse, and he's like smiling, laughing.
Yeah.
But
Right.
he's getting shot at.
And he's ducking every time you hear a gunshot. He ducks.
Right. And
But
they could have done better at the time. I mean, we have other examples where it just, it was possible technically, but
But I wonder if part of that was even intentional to show that the film was nothing more than a big
yeah,
parody,
who
really.
knows?
Yeah.
What I really love
Yes.
is nothing bad about the film, but I really love him when he's hiding behind the sunflowers. God, I love that.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
a great
It's
iconic
just
scene.
so cute. Oh,
Yeah.
It's interesting if we could just segue back to what you were saying. That final scene of the Kentucky Derby when he's riding the horse. I always saw that. I always looked at it in a slightly different way. I've always admired the technical aspects of actually filming that horse race, not the close-up scenes where obviously it's a close-up, so he's not sitting on a real horse, but the scenes where there is obviously the camera is mounted on a automobile which is racing ahead of the actual horses,
Yeah.
filming them.
yeah.
I thought, gee, this is pretty revolutionary. But they wanted to get that sense of the race,
Of the
and
speed. Yeah.
and also I thought that some of the dialogue when the horses are lining up, and you can hear the fella who's supposed to keep them in line, the guy that fires the gun. He's talking. Keep that horse in line. Don't do this. You take a run at me, I'll give you a rest. And I thought, gee, I think what they're trying to do here is they're playing with this very, very new technology of sound, and they're trying to, I think, impress the audience with kind of a cinema verite, even though it's not really, but they're trying to capture some of the sounds that you would have maybe heard if you were there, and they're playing with it. Otherwise, I don't see why they would, put that in. So
No, it could be.
I
Yeah.
think you see some experimentation as to how to use the sound and capture maybe some of that ambient dialogue that you would be hearing if you were, near the starting line.
That's something I didn't think of till now.
Yeah.
You're right.
And I think the style of the way the scene was shot, the one Nigel described about the chase scene, later on, you'd see just a few years later. I think you were able to see scenes that were filmed very similarly in some of the Three Stooges shorts. There are some Stooges shorts that are very reminiscent to me of that scene, where, like Vlad says, there might have been a camera mounted, and this scene is almost comically filmed, almost in an exaggeratedly fast or quick way, but It partly could have been because of the budget, because the Three Stooges shorts are obviously low budget because they were shorts, and Hollywood didn't always spend their most have a high budget for shorts back then. It was mostly all about the feature films. But I think that style was kind of prominent in lower budget films of the 1930s.
Yeah,
Now,
Jolson.
wrapping up this discussion, because we don't want to go too long, but I wanted to talk about briefly when the film came out. Do we know really how it did? According to what we talked about earlier, it didn't do too hot.
It
I,
did
I
not
I
do
think it read
very well.
did badly, right? I read about
It
that
it
recently.
only ran. I recall reading several reviews. And they said that essentially reviews said, well, Jolson gives his typical energetic performance. It's kind of a dated piece, and I think that it closed in after only playing several weeks, and at the same time, there was a Eddie Cantor musical that was playing that just did like gangbusters. I remember reading a story. I don't remember what the numbers were, saying that Cantor pulled in this much money at this theater in the same city during this run, with Jolson, and it was a small fraction. So the film didn't do well.
Right.
It
Yeah, so
probably it was somebody can correct me, but I think it was probably the least financially successful of all Jolson's films.
well, that would make sense because I'm looking at Jolson's filmography here, and right after Big Boy in 1930, he didn't make a film until 1933, and that was at a completely different studio, which was Hallelujah, I'm a
They
Bum.
were bummed,
Right.
right?
In
Right.
other words, his bankability as a star in Warner's eyes dropped so low that they didn't mind allowing him to sign a kind of a side contract with United Artists to, I think it was United Artists, wasn't it?
It was UA that did Hallelujah, I'm a Bum, yes.
Right. To do a couple of pictures, Hallelujah, I'm a Bum, which was really an experimental picture and best left for a future discussion because I think that's another film.
We could definitely do a whole show on
Oh
that.
God,
Oh yeah.
yes.
Probably the one film of Jolson's that survives best as an art film to this day.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
And I think it's one of Jolson's best performances. I think some of the scenes, especially the romantic scenes, he actually does show some acting ability that maybe
Yeah.
yes.
by then he had learned to not
That
overdo
less
it
is
and to
more.
lay
Yeah.
to lay off on the schmaltz, as we said.
But that's interesting to me that the lack of success of Mammy and to a larger degree Big Boy, both films that came out in 1930, kind of sent him away for a while. What did he do in 1931, 1932?
I believe he did the Broadway show Wonder Bar, which was his last Broadway show for another almost 10 years. I believe he did Wonder Bar during that time. He
And
went
that
back to the stage.
and that
And
brought him back to Warner Brothers in 34 when he did it as, once again, a film adaptation of Wonder
Right.
Yeah,
Bar.
and arguably it was Jolson's personal favorite of all of his films and arguably his best dramatic performance, but in a character role, which in the future we can discuss his transition later in his film career to being a character actor, and I think a very good one.
You're right.
And also in 1932 saw the beginning of Jolson's radio career, which would actually, the whole decade of the 1930s would be marked by radio and films, and as far as Jolson's career is concerned. And interestingly, he did a show sponsored by Chevrolet in 32, which actually led to the changing of some of the lyrics of the song Hallelujah, I'm a Bum. He had to change one of the lyrics from Ford to Chevy to reflect the fact that the sponsorship to his radio show was Chevy and not Ford.
And Big Boy kind of marks the end of an era. It's kind of the end of the jazz singer run of films that threw Jolson's star out there as being one of Hollywood's biggest stars, and it kind of deflated into Mammy and Big Boy, and then that was the point where Warner Brothers kind of let him go for a while. He'd come back, but it was never the same after that.
Right, and it's interesting also to note that Big Boy and Mammy were both almost trying to cash in on the past of Jolson. Big Boy from his stage career and Mammy from the whole genre of minstrel shows. So at the time, even then, they kind of knew that, okay, in order to sell Jolson as a star, we have to sell what made him famous. And those are things that are in the past already.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and all of with the single exception of Hallelujah, I'm a Bum, which was an experimental type of musical that he did for a different studio. All of the rest of Jolson's films with Warner Brothers and the two films that he made for 20th Century Fox acquired a lot of big name co-stars
Mm-hmm.
because he could no longer carry, or at least in the views of the the heads of the studios, he was no longer viable as the sole star to carry the film.
And one of whom was Ruby Keeler in
Yeah.
1935.
Right.
And then later, Don Amici and Tyrone Power, Alice Faye, and many others. You're absolutely right.
Cab Calloway. Yeah.
Cab Calloway. Yep.
And Big Boy's kind of a lost Jolson film, in my opinion. I mean, it isn't, but it is in a way, because when they reissued all the Jolson films on VHS in the late 80s, early 90s, Big Boy was not there. I mean, it's part of that Laserdisc set that came out.
Right.
But I'm sorry, Big Boy and Say It Was Songs were the two films that they did not reissue on VHS.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
up until the DVDs came out, the only way you could see those films was, well, legally, officially, was to get laser discs of them, and that really says a lot. It shows that even in the 80s, that they didn't think Big Boy and Say It Was Songs were popular enough to sell on to a home market.
And we might as well give a free plug here to Warner Brothers for a good deed that they did for all film aficionados. Some years back, maybe within about 10 years ago, they established a Warner Archive collection, which you can go online to Warner Archive. You just Google it and it'll come up, where they make available hundreds and hundreds of films, including all of Jolson's Warner Brothers films, from their archive that you can order, and essentially they custom burn a DVD of that film for you. Films that, today would be too obscure to rate a full release. But
like Big Boy, for example.
Like Big Boy, but you can go to the Warner Archive and online and order them, and it's wonderful. And anybody from Warner Brothers is listening to this, thank you for helping to keep history, not just of Jolson's films, but all those obscure films alive.
It's funny to me that they, on the recent DVD archive cover for Big Boy, I think they use a picture of Jolson from The Singing Fool on it.
Right.
Oh, really?
Needless to say, the character of Gus is nowhere to be seen, and that's okay. The important thing
but
is that the film's available.
That's laziness on their part, because if they were convinced they wanted a picture of him in whiteface, they could have taken a still shot from the very last scene of Big Boy instead of just taking whatever popular photo of Jolson they could find.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Also,
but at least it's out. At least it's
there.
out.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and hopefully, after listening to our discussion, maybe a few folks who haven't seen the film might decide to view it and might see it in a completely different way than they otherwise might experience it in 2016.
Agreed. Final thoughts on Big Boy, anyone?
I just have a final question I wanted to throw out there to people who might be able to answer that. When it comes to the stage character of Gus, I was always wondering if anyone else besides Jolson at his time was doing something similar. I know, of course, about the roots, European and roots from antiquity, when it comes to these blackface, mask theater traditions and everything. But at the time Jolson was doing it on Broadway, established theater stages, I was wondering if anyone else was doing something similar. Playing this outwitting character like he did. That would be interesting to know.
Jolson himself said much later that audiences were shocked that he would have the courage to say the things he said and do the things he did in blackface. So
really?
If anyone else, while he was on stage in the character of Gus, so if anyone else did it, my guess is that they did it after Jolson had already blazed the trail and not.
Yeah.
Yeah, an interview later in his life, he commented that he wasn't the very first person to wear a blackface on a Broadway stage, but he was the first person to carry an entire show as a character in blackface and to talk back to the audience.
Yeah, that was a positive character. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Thank you again for listening to this third installment. This is our first feature film discussion of a Jolson film, and I think it went really well. I think our commentary for the film is actually longer than the film itself. So, but
almost as funny, right? Almost as funny.
Like I said, it was a little quickie film. Warner Brothers cranked out in a year where there was another Jolson film already out there. But if you look at it in the context that we discussed, it's an interesting film to go back and rewatch and maybe have a new appreciation for. So for that, I'm thankful.
Yeah,
it's a very, very fun and very, very funny film. Once you understand the context, and as hopefully, which our discussion will help some folks to do who might not have seen it, and you can watch the film and just relax and enjoy enjoy the fact that it's just funny as heck.
And putting yourself in a 1930 mindset. So
The audience that's going to be listening to this podcast is, in other words, I'm probably preaching to the choir. But if you haven't seen it, go see it and see it with an open mind.
Exactly. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.